clutching the deed to a weather-beaten farmhouse in rural Pennsylvania, his last desperate chance from an unexpected inheritance, retired Army Sergeant Jackson Reid turns his back on years of city life to chase what many called an impossible dream in the forgotten hills of Clearfield County. What begins as a reckless attempt to find peace leads him to a padlocked steel door hidden beneath decades of overgrowth in the property's abandoned equipment shed. What Jackson doesn't realize is that the chamber concealed underground isn't just a Cold War relic. It's the long-lost archive of renowned historian Dr. Eleanor Whitaker, who vanished 30 years ago while researching Revolutionary War-era military communications. As local museum director Dr. Chen helps authenticate his discovery, Jackson finds himself torn between immediate financial security and revealing historical treasures that could rewrite American military history, but might cost him the fresh start he desperately needs. This unforgettable story explores how true valor isn't measured in battlefield medals or combat scars, but in the courage to honor the past while forging an unexpected future. Before we dive deeper, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something truly extraordinary for you. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the overgrown fields as Jackson Reid stood at the edge of the gravel driveway, surveying what was now his property. 40 acres of neglected farmland, a dilapidated two-story farmhouse, and several outbuildings in various states of disrepair. At 38, the former Army Sergeant's face was weathered beyond his years, lines etched around his eyes from squinting against desert suns and the weight of memories he couldn't escape. Not exactly what I pictured for retirement, he muttered to himself, adjusting the brace on his left knee, a permanent souvenir from his final deployment to Afghanistan. The injury had ended his military career 3 years earlier, forcing him into civilian life with nothing but a modest pension, a collection of medals he kept in a shoebox, and recurring nightmares that made holding down a steady job in Philadelphia nearly impossible. The property before him represented his last chance at a fresh start. His great-uncle Wallace, a man he'd met only twice, had left him this forgotten farm and enough money to cover back taxes and initial repairs. The lawyer's letter had arrived just as Jackson's landlord had served him with eviction papers, timing that felt less like coincidence and more like a final lifeline thrown to a drowning man. The inheritance wasn't what anyone would call a windfall. The farm had been abandoned for over a decade before Wallace acquired it at auction, and the old man had lived in the city, rarely visiting the property he'd purchased for reasons he never explained to anyone. But to Jackson, whose life had been reduced to a studio apartment he could no longer afford, and nightmares that kept him isolated from whatever community might have helped him transition to civilian life, it represented something invaluable. Possibility. A hawk circled overhead, its cry piercing the heavy silence as Jackson made his way toward the farmhouse. The porch steps creaked ominously under his weight, the weathered boards bowing slightly, the key stuck in the lock, requiring a forceful jiggle before the door finally swung open with a protesting groan, releasing the musty scent of abandonment. Inside, sheets draped over sparse furniture cast ghostly silhouettes in the fading light. Dust motes danced in the beams of sunlight that penetrated the grimy windows. The air hung heavy with neglect, a feeling Jackson recognized all too well from the apartments he'd cycled through since leaving the service, spaces he occupied but never truly inhabited. Home, sweet home. he murmured, dropping his duffel bag on the floor with a thud that echoed through the empty rooms. That night, Jackson slept on a camping cot in what would eventually become the living room, his few possessions still packed. As if part of him remained unconvinced this wasn't just another temporary shelter. Outside, the unfamiliar chorus of crickets and distant coyotes replaced the city sounds he'd grown accustomed to. The darkness here was different too, complete in a way urban darkness never could be. The stars visible through the windows with startling clarity. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by the usual nightmares, explosions, shouted orders, the weight of a fellow soldier he couldn't save. Each time he woke gasping, the unfamiliar surroundings momentarily intensified his disorientation until reality slowly reasserted itself. This was Clearfield County, Pennsylvania. The war was 5 years behind him. He was alone on a forgotten farm that somehow, improbably, belonged to him now. Morning brought a clearer assessment of what he'd inherited. The house, while structurally sound, needed extensive work. New plumbing, updated electrical wiring, repairs to the roof, and a thorough purging of the mice that had claimed certain corners as their domain. The fields, once cultivated for corn and hay according to the property records, had surrendered to wild grasses and encroaching forest at the boundaries. The outbuildings told a similar story of neglect. A barn with a partially collapsed roof, a chicken coop reclaimed by nature, and a squat, concrete equipment shed that looked sturdier than the other structures, its padlocked door crusted with rust but intact. Jackson made a mental note to check if the key ring from the lawyer included one that might open it. The nearest town was Ridgemont, a small community that had seen better days before the decline of coal mining and manufacturing in the region. Jackson drove his aging pickup down the main street, noting the mix of occupied storefronts and vacant buildings with faded for-lease signs in grimy windows. At the hardware store, he loaded up with basic supplies, tools, cleaning materials, mousetraps, a new padlock for the front door. "You're the one who bought the old Mercer place," the cashier commented as she rang up his purchases. It wasn't a question. "News travels fast," Jackson replied, somewhat taken aback. The woman, whose name tag identified her as Betty, chuckled. "That's Ridgemont for you. We don't get many newcomers, especially not ones taking on renovation projects. Most young folks are moving away, not in." "I'm hardly young," Jackson said with a wry smile, conscious of the gray beginning to show at his temples. "You serving?" Betty asked, nodding toward the military-style watch on his wrist and the way he stood, habits that marked veterans to those who knew what to look for. "Army, 3 tours in Afghanistan." Betty's expression softened. "My son did 2 in Iraq. 10th Mountain Division." The simple acknowledgement created an immediate understanding between them. There was no need for the usual, awkward expressions of gratitude for his service or prying questions about his experiences. Just recognition from someone who understood the unspoken cost. "Farm's been empty a long while," Betty continued as she totaled his purchases. "Folks wondered what would happen to it after old Wallace Reid passed. Never did understand why he bought it just to let it sit. He was my great-uncle," Jackson explained. "Never knew him well. Surprised me as much as anyone when his lawyer said he'd left it to me." "Well," Betty said, handing him his receipt, "Ridgemont could use some new blood, and that property's got good bones despite the state it's in. My husband Ron runs the diner down the street. Stop in sometime. He makes a meatloaf on Thursdays. That'll change your life." The unexpected welcome caught Jackson off guard. In Philadelphia, he'd been just another face in the crowd. Another struggling vet trying to piece together a life that made sense after the structured chaos of military service. Here, in the span of a 5-minute transaction, he'd been recognized, acknowledged, and invited into the community. Over the next 2 weeks, Jackson fell into a routine that felt more purposeful than anything he'd experienced since leaving the service. Each day began with a list of tasks, practical, achievable goals that provided the structure he'd been missing. Clean out one room in the house, repair the porch railing, assess what could be salvaged from the barn before it needed to be demolished. The physical labor was therapeutic in ways the VA counselors suggested activities had never been. Working with his hands, seeing tangible results from his efforts, allowed him to focus on the present moment rather than dwelling on the past or anxiously anticipating the future. A form of mindfulness more effective than any meditation practice he'd half-heartedly attempted. He made occasional trips into town, gradually becoming familiar with the rhythms of Ridgemont. True to Betty's suggestion, he tried the diner, where her husband Ron greeted him like an old friend rather than a stranger, and where he discovered the meatloaf was indeed worth the recommendation. The other regulars regarded him with cautious curiosity at first, but there was none of the strained politeness he often encountered when people learned of his military background. "Hard work you're doing out there," commented Earl Lewis, a retired factory worker who occupied the same corner booth each morning when Jackson stopped in for coffee after picking up supplies. "Folks been watching you coming and going. Say you're making real progress." Jackson wasn't sure whether to be unsettled or comforted by the fact that his efforts were being observed and discussed. In the city, anonymity had been both shield and prison. Here, the community awareness felt invasive yet strangely reassuring. He was seen, his presence registered in the social fabric of the place. "Trying to," he responded. "House needs more work than I initially thought, but I'm getting there." "You planning to farm the land?" Earl asked. "Soil's good there from what I recall. Mercer's grew sweet corn that won ribbons at the county fair back in the day." Jackson shook his head. "Don't know the first thing about farming, just trying to make the place livable for now." Earl nodded thoughtfully. "Well, if you change your mind, my nephew Marcus teaches over at the community college. Agricultural science. Smart kid, knows all about modern farming techniques. Could give you some pointers." The casual offer of connection and assistance was becoming a pattern in his interactions with Ridgemont residents, a willingness to share knowledge, resources, and contacts that contrasted sharply with the urban isolation he'd grown accustomed to. By the end of the second week, Jackson had made the farmhouse minimally habitable. He'd cleared out the most dilapidated furniture, scrubbed years of grime from the windows and floors, repaired the worst of the plumbing issues, and established a bedroom in what had once been a study on the first floor, allowing him to avoid the creaking stairs that aggravated his knee at the end of long days of physical labor. On a particularly hot afternoon, having spent the morning replacing rotted boards on the porch, he turned his attention to the outbuildings. The barn was beyond his immediate capabilities to repair, but the equipment shed, solidly built from concrete blocks with a corrugated metal roof, seemed worth investigating. Its heavy padlock had thus far resisted his efforts, but today he was armed with bolt cutters purchased specifically for the task. The lock surrendered with a satisfying snap, falling to the ground as Jackson pulled open the door. The interior was dark, illuminated only by the shaft of sunlight that followed him inside. As his eyes adjusted, he made out the shapes of old farm equipment, a tractor in surprisingly good condition, various implements whose purposes he couldn't immediately identify, shelves lined with tools and canisters. But it was the floor that captured his attention, specifically a section at the rear of the shed that didn't match the rest. While most of the foundation was poured concrete, this rectangular section, approximately 8 feet by 6 feet, consisted of wooden planks laid flush against each other. More curiously, there was a metallic glint at one edge, what appeared to be a recessed handle. Jackson moved cautiously toward it, pushing aside a metal drum to clear his path. Kneeling despite the protest from his knee, he brushed away decades of accumulated dust to reveal what was undeniably a trapdoor, complete with hinges on one side and a locking mechanism on the other. The handle was actually part of a sophisticated latch now seized with age and disuse. "What the hell?" he muttered, running his fingers along the edge of the door. This was no simple access point to a storage cellar or root vegetables. The construction was far too elaborate, the metal components too professionally installed. Using a screwdriver from his pocket, Jackson worked at the latch, applying penetrating oil from a can he found on a nearby shelf. After several minutes of careful manipulation, he was rewarded with a grudging click as the mechanism released. Taking a deep breath, he gripped the handle and pulled. The trapdoor rose slowly, its weight substantial, despite the counterbalancing springs now visible on the underside. As it opened fully, a rush of cool, stale air escaped from the darkness below. Jackson retrieved the flashlight from his back pocket, directing its beam into the opening. A metal staircase descended about 10 feet to a concrete floor. The beam of light revealed walls lined with what appeared to be metal shelving, and at the far end, barely visible in the flashlight's reach, a heavy steel door. Jackson hesitated at the threshold. His military training screamed caution. Unknown spaces in conflict zones often concealed dangers ranging from tripwires to waiting enemies. But this was rural Pennsylvania, not Kandahar province. Still, years of ingrained vigilance weren't easily dismissed. Keeping the flashlight trained ahead of him, he descended the stairs slowly, each step solid beneath his weight, despite years of disuse. At the bottom, he swept the beam around the space, revealing a chamber approximately 20 feet square. The walls were poured concrete, the ceiling supported by steel I-beams. The shelving units contained boxes and metal containers arranged with military precision, each bearing labels with dates and cryptic abbreviated codes. The chamber had the unmistakable characteristics of a Cold War-era bunker, built to withstand anything short of a direct nuclear strike. But while such shelters typically contained survival supplies and equipment, this one appeared to house something entirely different. The boxes weren't labeled with contents like rations or medical supplies, but with what looked like archival designations. COM 1775 PHL, on Mildisp 1776 TRN, NEINT 1777. At the far end, the steel door bore a different style of lock than the trapdoor above, more sophisticated, with what appeared to be a combination dial rather than a key mechanism. Beside it, bolted to the wall, was a small metal box. Jackson directed his flashlight beam at it, discovering a numeric keypad partially concealed behind a hinged cover. This was no ordinary farm bunker stocked with survival supplies. Whatever lay beyond that door had been secured with far more care than typical emergency preparations would warrant. The methodical organization of the containers already visible suggested an archive rather than a shelter, a collection carefully preserved and protected from both the elements and, apparently, discovery. As Jackson stood in the cool silence of the underground chamber, questions multiplied in his mind. Who had built this facility? What did the cryptic labels signify? And perhaps most perplexing, why had his reclusive great-uncle purchased a foreclosed farm only to leave it abandoned, its secret bunker undisturbed? The mystery before him stood in stark contrast to the straightforward tasks that had occupied his days thus far. Repairing broken steps and replacing rusted pipes were problems with clear solutions, tangible challenges he could address with his hands. But this underground chamber, with its carefully organized containers and secured door, presented something entirely different. A puzzle whose pieces extended beyond the property lines of his inherited farm and into a past he couldn't yet decipher. What Jackson couldn't know as he stood in the beam of his flashlight, surrounded by the silent testimony of someone's careful preservation efforts, was that the contents of this bunker would soon draw him into a historical mystery that would challenge not only his understanding of American military history, but also his perception of his own place in the continuing story of service, sacrifice, and unexpected purpose. The harsh beam of Jackson's flashlight played across the metal containers, their military-style labeling raising more questions than answers. Whatever this underground chamber contained, it wasn't the typical Cold War survivalist stash he might have expected. The organization was too meticulous, the cataloging system too sophisticated for a civilian's emergency preparations. As a former reconnaissance specialist, Jackson had been trained to observe and document before taking action. That training reasserted itself now as he systematically examined the space, careful not to disturb anything until he understood what he was dealing with. Dust had settled evenly across the surfaces, undisturbed for what appeared to be years, possibly decades. There were no footprints other than his own, no indication that anyone had accessed this chamber recently. The temperature was noticeably cooler than the summer heat above, the air dry despite the underground location. Someone had engineered this space for preservation, installing what Jackson now noticed was a dehumidification system along one wall. Though non-operational due to lack of power, its presence spoke to the deliberate care taken to protect whatever was stored here. Jackson approached one of the metal containers, wiping away dust to better see its label. Co-MM 11775 PHL was printed, in precise lettering followed by a numeric code. Hesitantly, he tried the latches, which released with surprising ease. Inside, he found stacks of document sleeves, each containing what appeared to be letters, many written in a tight, slanting hand on yellowed paper. The top document was protected by a clear archival sleeve. Jackson carefully lifted it, holding it under his flashlight. The heading read, Philadelphia, October 17th, 1775, and was signed at the bottom with a flourishing signature he couldn't immediately identify. The content appeared to be military in nature, discussing supply routes and troop movements. Jackson's heart rate quickened. If these were authentic Revolutionary War documents, they belonged in a museum or university archive, not hidden beneath an abandoned farm in rural Pennsylvania. What's more, they appeared to be originals rather than copies, historical artifacts of potentially immense value. He replaced the document exactly as he'd found it, securing the container's latches. The implications were staggering. But he needed more information before jumping to conclusions. His gaze returned to the steel door at the end of the room. Whatever lay beyond it might provide context for this unexpected discovery. The combination lock appeared to be a standard model, albeit an older one. The electronic keypad beside it, however, suggested a secondary security system had been added later. Both would present significant obstacles without the correct codes. Jackson had acquired certain skills during his military service that might apply to the mechanical lock, but the electronic system would require different expertise altogether. For now, he decided to focus on what he could access. He spent the next hour carefully cataloging the visible containers, taking photos with his phone of the labeling system without opening any more of them. Based on the date codes, the collection appeared to span primarily from 1775 through 1783, the Revolutionary War period. Geographic indicators suggested a focus on the mid-Atlantic region, with particular emphasis on Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York. As the afternoon light began to fade, casting the shed above in deepening shadow, Jackson reluctantly climbed the metal stairs back to the surface. He secured the trapdoor as he'd found it, then locked the shed with a new padlock from his supplies. Whatever this discovery represented, he needed time to process it and determine the appropriate next steps. That evening, seated at the kitchen table in the farmhouse, Jackson researched Revolutionary War archives on his laptop. The spotty rural internet connection frustrated his efforts, but he managed to gather enough information to confirm his suspicion. Original military documents from that era were exceedingly rare and valuable, with many known collections housed in prestigious institutions like the Library of Congress and the National Archives. His search also yielded an unexpected connection. Clearfield County Historical Society listed a Dr. Eleanor Whitaker as having conducted extensive research on Revolutionary War military communications in the region during the 1980s and early 1990s, before her disappearance in 1993. The brief biography mentioned that Dr. Whitaker had been particularly interested in undocumented intelligence networks operating throughout the Pennsylvania frontier during the Revolutionary period, and had published several academic papers on the subject before she vanished under mysterious circumstances. The timing aligned suspiciously with his great-uncle's purchase of the farm. Wallace Reid had acquired the property at auction in 1994, just months after Whitaker's disappearance. Had there been a connection between the historian and his reclusive relative? And more importantly, was the collection in the bunker Whitaker's research materials secured for some unknown purpose? Jackson's military training had instilled in him a methodical approach to problem-solving. He needed more information, and he needed expertise beyond his own limited knowledge of historical artifacts. The bunker's contents potentially represented both significant historical value and complex legal questions about ownership and proper stewardship. The following morning, Jackson drove into Ridgemont with a new purpose. His first stop was the local library, a modest brick building that served as the town's information hub. The librarian, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s named Irene Fowler, greeted him with the familiarity small towns reserved for recognized newcomers. "You're the veteran fixing up the old Mercer place," she said, putting aside the book she'd been cataloging. "Betty at the hardware store mentioned you might stop by eventually. Said you seemed like a reader." Jackson smiled despite his preoccupation. "Word gets around fast here." "Fastest thing in Ridgemont is the gossip chain," Irene replied good-naturedly. "What can I help you with today?" "I'm looking for information about local history," Jackson said carefully. "Specifically anything related to Dr. Eleanor Whitaker. I understand she did historical research in this area years ago." Irene's expression shifted subtly, interest sharpening her gaze. "Eleanor Whitaker," she repeated. "Now that's a name I haven't heard in quite some time. She was something of a local legend, brilliant historian, passionate about Revolutionary War history, especially the untold stories. Disappeared without a trace in '93. "Did you know her?" Jackson asked, sensing the personal connection in Irene's. "And tone. Everyone in Ridgemont knew Eleanor," Irene said, moving from behind the counter. "She wasn't originally from here, but she became part of the community during her research. Spent nearly a decade combing through local archives, interviewing families with roots going back generations, exploring old properties with revolutionary connections." She led Jackson to a section of shelving labeled Local History and pulled several slender volumes from the collection. "These are her published works, not widely distributed. Academic press runs are small, but she left copies with us." Jackson accepted the books, noting the author photograph on the back cover of the topmost volume. Eleanor Whitaker had been a striking woman in her 40s, with intelligent eyes and an expression of focused determination. Something about her seemed vaguely familiar, though he was certain they'd never met. "What happened to her?" he asked, following Irene back to the main desk. The librarian sighed. "That's the question, isn't it? One day she was here, working on what she described as a groundbreaking discovery, and the next she was gone. Her rental cabin was found empty. Research notes, personal belongings, everything vanished with her. Police investigation turned up nothing. Some thought she'd simply moved on to another project elsewhere. But those who knew her best never believed that Eleanor wouldn't have left without finishing her work here." "You mentioned a groundbreaking discovery," Jackson prompted. "Any idea what that might have been?" Irene considered this. She was excited, I remember that. More secretive than usual in those final weeks. Eleanor had been researching what she called shadow communications, intelligence networks that operated throughout Pennsylvania during the Revolution, carrying information that was too sensitive for regular military dispatches. She believed she'd found evidence of an undocumented network centered right here in Clearfield County. The connection to the labeled containers in the bunker was unmistakable. Jackson felt a tightening in his chest, the familiar tension that accompanied mission-critical information. "Is there anyone still around who worked closely with her? Someone who might know more about her research?" "Dr. Marcus Chen at the County Museum," Irene replied without hesitation. "He was just starting his career when Eleanor disappeared. I believe he worked as her research assistant for a time. If anyone would know the details of her work, it would be Marcus." The name sparked recognition. "Marcus Chen? Any relation to a professor at the community college? Agricultural science?" Irene laughed. "One and the same. Marcus wears many hats around here. Museum director, adjunct professor, historical preservation, advocate. Small towns make do with the expertise they have on hand." Armed with Eleanor Whitaker's published works and directions to the County Museum, Jackson thanked Irene and left the library, his mind working to connect the emerging threads. The bunker, the Revolutionary War documents, Whitaker's disappearance, and his great-uncle's subsequent purchase of the property. Pieces of a puzzle that was beginning to take shape, though the complete picture remained elusive. The Clearfield County Historical Museum occupied a converted Victorian home on a quiet side street. Its well-maintained exterior and carefully tended gardens stood in contrast to the neglected storefronts on Main Street, suggesting a level of care and commitment that transcended the town's economic challenges. A small sign in the window indicated the museum was open, though Jackson appeared to be the only visitor that morning. He entered to find a modest but professionally arranged exhibition space, with displays chronicling the region's evolution from Native American territory through agricultural development, coal mining prosperity, and subsequent industrial decline. A tall, trim Asian-American man in his 50s emerged from a back office, adjusting his glasses as he approached. "Welcome to the Clearfield County Historical Museum," he said warmly. "I'm Marcus Chen, the director. Let me know if you have any questions about our exhibitions." "Actually," Jackson replied, "I was hoping to speak with you specifically. Irene Fowler at the library suggested you might be able to help me. I'm Jackson Reid. I recently inherited the old Mercer property from my great-uncle Wallace." Recognition flickered in Chen's expression. Wallace Reid's great-nephew. Interesting. He studied Jackson with newfound curiosity. "Why don't we speak in my office? It sounds like you have questions that go beyond our general exhibitions." Chen's office reflected the mind of an organized academic. Bookshelves lined with historical texts, walls adorned with maps of varying ages, showing the same geographical region through different historical periods. A desk cluttered with research materials, but in a system clearly understood by its occupant. "So," Chen said after they were seated, "what brings Wallace Reid's heir to my doorstep? I wasn't aware he had family in the area." "He didn't," Jackson confirmed. "I barely knew him. The inheritance was unexpected, to say the least." Chen nodded thoughtfully. "Wallace was something of a mystery in Ridgemont. Bought the property and then visited maybe twice a year. Never explained his interest in a failing farm in a region he had no apparent connection to." Jackson decided directness was the best approach. "I recently discovered something unusual on the property, a bunker beneath the equipment shed, containing what appear to be Revolutionary War-era documents and correspondence. Based on the labeling system, I believe they may be connected to Dr. Eleanor Whitaker's research." The effect of his words on Chen was immediate. The museum director went completely still, his expression shifting from polite interest to intense focus. "You found Eleanor's archive?" he asked quietly. "I believe so," Jackson replied. "Though I'm still working to understand exactly what I've found. Irene mentioned you were her research assistant." Chen removed his glasses, cleaning them methodically with a handkerchief, a gesture that seemed calculated to provide a moment for gathering his thoughts. "I worked with Eleanor during my graduate studies," he confirmed. "She was brilliant, driven, occasionally difficult, everything you'd expect from a mind operating several levels above those around her." He replaced his glasses, fixing Jackson with a direct gaze. "Before we continue, I need to understand your intentions. Those materials, if they are indeed Eleanor's research collection, represent potentially significant historical artifacts with implications for our understanding of Revolutionary War intelligence operations. What do you plan to do with them?" The question cut to the heart of the dilemma Jackson had been wrestling with since his discovery. As the legal owner of the property and presumably its contents, he had certain rights. But the historical and Academic value of the collection created ethical obligations that transcended simple ownership. Honestly, I'm still processing what I found, Jackson admitted. I don't have the expertise to evaluate the collection properly. That's partly why I'm here. I need to understand what I'm dealing with before I can make informed decisions. Chen studied him for a moment longer, then nodded, apparently satisfied with the response. Eleanor believed she had discovered evidence of a previously undocumented intelligence network operating throughout the Pennsylvania frontier during the Revolution, he explained. Not the well-known Culper Ring that operated around New York, but a separate organization focused on monitoring British movements and indigenous alliances in the Western Territories. And did she find evidence, I mean? Jackson asked. She was certainly convinced she had, Chen replied. In the weeks before her disappearance, Eleanor was increasingly excited, but also increasingly cautious. She spoke of primary source documents that would rewrite the textbooks, but refused to share their location even with me. She was concerned about their security, not just their physical preservation, but their protection from what she called interested parties who might prefer certain historical realities remain obscured. Jackson thought of the secure bunker with its combination lock and electronic keypad. She went to considerable lengths to protect whatever she found. That would be consistent with her character, Chen agreed. Eleanor was passionate about historical truth, especially when it contradicted comfortable narratives. She believed history belonged to everyone, not just those with the power to shape its telling. Do you have any idea what happened to her? Jackson asked. Chen's expression darkened. Officially, no. The investigation concluded she had simply chosen to leave the area. Those who knew her never accepted that explanation. Eleanor wouldn't have abandoned her research at such a critical juncture. He leaned forward, lowering his voice despite the empty museum around them. There were rumors, never substantiated, that she had run afoul of collectors or private interests who didn't appreciate her methods. Eleanor wasn't above bending rules when she believed the historical record was at stake. She occasionally mentioned recovering documents from private collections where they were being hoarded rather than studied. The implication hung in the air between them. Had Eleanor Whitaker's zeal for historical preservation led her into legally questionable territory? And if so, what did that mean for the collection now in Jackson's possession? Your great-uncle purchased that property very quickly after Eleanor's disappearance, Chen continued, his tone carefully neutral. There was speculation at the time about his sudden interest in a foreclosed farm with no agricultural potential. Some wondered if he knew something about Eleanor or her work that others didn't. Jackson absorbed this information, adding another layer to the mystery. Had Wallace Reid been connected to Whitaker somehow? Had he purchased the property specifically to protect the bunker and its contents? If so, why leave it to a great-nephew he barely knew rather than to someone familiar with its historical significance? I'd like to see this collection, Chen said, interrupting Jackson's thoughts. If it is Eleanor's research archive, it represents the culmination of her life's work. Its historical significance could be substantial. Jackson hesitated, weighing his options. Chen's expertise would be invaluable in understanding what he'd discovered, but inviting someone else into the secret felt like an irrevocable step. Once, knowledge of the bunker's existence spread beyond him. Controlling what happened to its contents would become increasingly difficult. Yet keeping the discovery to himself wasn't a viable option either. Without proper expertise, he risked mishandling historically significant materials or failing to recognize their true importance. And if the documents had been recovered through extra-legal means, as Chen had delicately suggested, there could be complicated questions of ownership and repatriation to address. "I'd appreciate your expertise," Jackson decided finally, "but for now I'd like to keep knowledge of this discovery between us until we better understand what we're dealing with." Chen nodded, understanding evident in his expression. "A reasonable precaution. When would you like me to examine the collection?" "Tomorrow morning," Jackson suggested. "I need to verify the security of the site first and make sure we can access it safely." As they finalized arrangements for Chen's visit, Jackson found himself reflecting on the strange turn his life had taken. He had come to Ridgemont seeking nothing more than shelter and solitude, a place to rebuild after years of struggling to find his footing in civilian life. Instead, he had stumbled into a historical mystery with implications that extended far beyond the boundaries of his inherited property. A mystery that was already beginning to give him something he had been missing since leaving the military: purpose. The morning dawned clear and cool, a welcome reprieve from the summer heat that had baked the region for weeks. Jackson had spent the previous evening securing the bunker entrance more thoroughly, replacing the rusty padlock on the equipment shed with a new heavy-duty model and ensuring the trapdoor mechanism was functioning properly. He'd also run an extension cord from the house to power temporary lighting in the underground chamber, unwilling to rely solely on flashlights for Chen's examination of the materials. As he waited for the museum director's arrival, Jackson found himself uncharacteristically anxious. During his military service, he had handled classified information and sensitive operations with steady nerves. But this was different. He wasn't. Operating within the clear chain of command and established protocols that had structured his previous life. Here, he alone would bear responsibility for whatever decisions were made about the collection. A vehicle approaching on the gravel driveway pulled him from his thoughts. Chen's modest sedan kicked up dust as it came to a stop beside Jackson's truck. The museum director emerged carrying a canvas bag that presumably contained tools of his trade, whatever equipment historians use to examine antiquities. "Good morning," Chen called, his expression reflecting professional eagerness barely contained. "I confess I had trouble sleeping last night. The possibility of accessing Eleanor's lost research after all these years is, well, it's the kind of opportunity historians dream about." Jackson led him toward the equipment shed, noting how Chen's gaze swept across the property with the practiced assessment of someone accustomed to reading landscapes for historical context. The farm was originally established in the 1790s, Chen remarked as they walked, after the revolution, but early enough to have been part of the region's initial settlement period. The location is interesting, elevated enough to provide clear sight lines across the valley, positioned near what would have been a major transportation route in the 18th century. Jackson hadn't considered the strategic aspects of the property's situation. "You think that's significant?" "Potentially. If Eleanor's theories about a local intelligence network were correct, this location would have been ideal for monitoring movement through the valley." Chen gestured toward the distant ridgeline. "Signal fires along those hills could have relayed messages for miles in either direction." They reached the shed, and Jackson unlocked the new padlock, swinging the door open to reveal the dim interior. Dust motes danced in the shaft of morning light that followed them inside. Jackson led Chen to the rear, where the trapdoor remained concealed beneath its wooden covering. Eleanor suspected there were secure locations throughout the frontier where intelligence materials were stored, Chen said, watching as Jackson revealed the hidden entrance. Places only known to members of the network, where sensitive communications could be protected or dead-dropped for retrieval. The trapdoor opened, with less resistance than before, revealing the metal staircase descending into darkness below. Jackson flipped the switch on the portable worklight he'd positioned earlier, illuminating the underground chamber with harsh fluorescent brightness. Chen's intake of breath was audible as he took in the scene. The metal shelving units with their precisely arranged containers, the secure door at the far end, the military organization of the space. "This is it," he whispered, descending the stairs with reverent steps. "This is definitely Eleanor's collection. I recognize her cataloging system from our work together." Jackson followed him down, watching as the historian moved through the space with increasing excitement. Chen approached one of the shelving units, examining the labels without touching the containers themselves. "The coding is her custom archival system," he explained. COM for communications, 1775 for the year, PHL for Philadelphia. MIL-DISP would be military dispatches, ENYINT would be enemy intelligence. She developed this method for her personal use, more efficient than traditional archival classifications for field research. Chen turned to Jackson, his expression transformed by scholarly enthusiasm. "Do you understand what we're looking at? This isn't just a collection of historical documents. It's a comprehensive archive of Revolutionary War intelligence operations that has never been studied by modern historians. The academic significance is incalculable." "And the containers?" Jackson asked. I opened one briefly. It contained what appeared to be original letters. If Eleanor's research methods held true, each container would hold original documents, protected in archival sleeves, along with her analysis notes, provenance information, and cross-references to related materials. Chen approached the container Jackson had examined. "May I?" Jackson nodded, and Chen carefully opened the latches with gloved hands he'd pulled from his bag. Inside, exactly as Chen had predicted, were the document sleeves Jackson had glimpsed, along with a research notebook filled with Eleanor's detailed handwriting. "This is extraordinary," Chen murmured, gently examining the top document without removing it from its protective sleeve. "This appears to be correspondence from the Continental Congress Committee of Secret Correspondence, the forerunner to what would eventually become America's Foreign Intelligence Services." He carefully returned the document, securing the container exactly as he'd found it. Based on the labeling, this collection spans the entire Revolutionary period, with particular emphasis on the years 1777 through 1779, the middle period of the war when British strategy shifted toward isolating New England from the southern colonies. Chen's gaze moved to the steel door at the end of the chamber. "What's beyond there?" "I don't know," Jackson admitted. "It's secured with both a combination lock and an electronic keypad. I haven't attempted to open it." The historian approached the door, examining its security features with evident interest. "This is modern, much newer than the rest of the facility. The electronic system appears to be from the early 1990s, consistent with when Eleanor would have been active here." He turned back to Jackson. Eleanor was protecting something significant, something valuable enough to warrant extraordinary security measures by her standards. In all my time working with her, I never saw her implement this level of protection for research materials. The implications hung in the air between them. Whatever lay beyond that door represented the core of Whitaker's research, possibly the groundbreaking discovery she had alluded to before her disappearance. We need to document everything properly. Before attempting to access the secured area, Chen said, professional caution reasserting itself. These materials require careful handling and systematic cataloging to preserve their historical context. Over the next several hours, they worked methodically through the visible collection. Chen photographed the organization system and examined a representative sample of documents from different containers, taking careful notes and occasionally consulting reference materials on his tablet. Jackson assisted as directed, handling the physical aspects of the work while absorbing Chen's running commentary on the historical significance of what they found. The picture that emerged was fascinating, even to Jackson's untrained perspective. Eleanor Whitaker had assembled evidence of a previously undocumented intelligence network operating throughout the Pennsylvania frontier during the Revolutionary War. Unlike the famous Culper Ring that operated around New York City and Long Island, this rural network had focused on monitoring British efforts to form alliances with Native American tribes and tracking enemy movements along the western frontier. The strategic implications are significant, Chen explained, as they carefully returned another container to its shelf. Conventional historical accounts suggest Washington was largely blind to British operations in the Western Territories. These documents indicate he had a sophisticated information network providing regular intelligence from the frontier, intelligence that would have informed critical military decisions during the middle years of the war. As the afternoon progressed, Jackson found himself increasingly drawn into the historical narrative taking shape around them. His military background gave him a particular appreciation for the tactical aspects of what they were discovering. The clever use of terrain features for signaling, the recruitment of ordinary farmers and tradespeople as informants, the coded communications designed to appear innocuous if intercepted. This reminds me of human intelligence networks in Afghanistan, he commented, as Chen explained a particularly ingenious method of concealing messages in routine commercial transactions. Same basic principles, utilizing existing social structures, maintaining plausible deniability, compartmentalizing information so no single person knows the entire operation. Chen looked up from his notes, regarding Jackson with new interest. Exactly. Intelligence-gathering fundamentals haven't changed, as much as the technology around them. You have experience with this aspect of military operations? Jackson nodded, not elaborating further. His specific role in reconnaissance operations remained classified, and the habits of operational security died hard. Eleanor would have appreciated that perspective, Chen said. She often argued that military historians without practical experience missed crucial contextual factors in their analysis. Your background might provide insights I would overlook. The observation created an unexpected connection between Jackson's military past and his current situation, a bridge between seemingly disconnected chapters of his life. For years, he had struggled to find civilian applications for the specialized skills he'd developed in the Army. Here, unexpectedly, that experience offered valuable perspective on historical materials that had remained hidden for centuries. By late afternoon, they had documented the accessible portion of the collection and faced the question of the secured door. Chen had photographed the lock mechanism and keypad, consulting with a preservation specialist colleague via text message about potential non-destructive entry methods. "We could attempt to bypass the security," he said finally, "but there's significant risk of damage, both to the mechanism itself and potentially to whatever is being protected. These systems often include countermeasures against unauthorized access." Jackson nodded, familiar with such protocols from his military background. "We need the combination and access codes. Any ideas where Whitaker might have left that information?" Chen considered this, tapping his pen against his notebook. Eleanor was methodical about everything. If she created this secure storage, she would have ensured legitimate access remained possible even if something happened to her. "Would she have shared the access information with anyone?" Jackson asked. "Unlikely, given her increasing caution before her disappearance. But she would have created some form of backup, possibly disguised or encrypted, but retrievable by someone who understood her methods." Chen's expression brightened with sudden realization. Her published works. Eleanor often embedded research, notes and cross-references in her formal publications, academic inside jokes, essentially. Colleagues familiar with her work would recognize them, but casual readers would never notice. Jackson retrieved the books they'd borrowed from the library, still in his truck from the previous day's research. Chen accepted them eagerly, flipping through the pages with practiced efficiency. "Here," he said after several minutes, pointing to a footnote in one of the slimmer volumes. "This reference doesn't connect to anything in the main text. It cites personal papers, Box WR 1994 CF, followed by a string of numbers that exceed standard page references." "WR 1994 CF, Jackson repeated. "Wallace Reid, 1994, Clearfield." Chen looked up sharply. That would fit Eleanor's coding system. If she anticipated trouble, she might have arranged for your great-uncle to serve as a contingency, someone who could secure her research if necessary. The connection created more questions than answers. Had Wallace Reid known Eleanor Whitaker? Had he purchased the property specifically to protect her collection after her disappearance? If so, why had he never accessed the bunker himself, at least as far as the undisturbed dust patterns suggested? The numeric sequence could be the combination or access code, Chen continued, copying the numbers into his notebook. "It's the right length for both the mechanical lock and the electronic system." They returned to the bunker, where Chen carefully entered the numeric sequence into the electronic keypad. After a moment's hesitation, a green light illuminated, accompanied by an audible click from within the door mechanism. The combination dial proved more challenging, requiring several attempts before Chen identified the correct sequence of rotations. Finally, with a heavy thunk, the last tumbler fell into place. "Ready?" Chen asked, his hand on the door handle, scholarly excitement radiating from him. Jackson nodded, equally curious but tempering his expectations. Their hours of methodical documentation had lent a ritualistic quality to this moment of revelation. Whatever lay beyond this door represented the culmination of Eleanor Whitaker's research and possibly the reason for her unexplained disappearance. The heavy door swung open smoothly, revealing a smaller chamber beyond. Unlike the organized archive in the main bunker, this space contained only a single object at its center, a glass display case, museum quality, with controlled humidity indicators visible on its exterior. Inside, resting on a velvet cushion, was a leather-bound journal that appeared significantly older than the research materials they had examined thus far. Chen approached reverently, examining the case without touching it. "This is extraordinary," he whispered. "Do you understand what we're looking at?" Before Jackson could respond, Chen continued, his voice tight with controlled excitement. "This appears to be an original field journal from the Revolutionary period, based on the visible markings and binding style, possibly belonging to a high-ranking officer or intelligence operative." "Why would this single item warrant such security?" Jackson asked, though he was beginning to understand the implications, based on Chen's reaction. "Primary source documents from intelligence operations in this period are exceedingly rare," Chen explained. "Most were deliberately destroyed to protect operatives and methods. A journal containing first-hand accounts of revolutionary espionage activities would be historically priceless, and I suspect potentially controversial if it contradicts established historical narratives about certain figures." Chen carefully examined the display case, which featured a modern locking mechanism requiring a key. Eleanor went to extraordinary lengths to preserve and protect this item. The case maintains optimal preservation conditions independent of the bunker environment. It has its own power source and environmental controls. Jackson surveyed the small chamber, noticing details he had overlooked in his initial focus on the display case. Along one wall stood a filing cabinet, and beside it a small desk with what appeared to be a journal, a modern one, placed precisely in the center, as if left intentionally for discovery. "What's that?" he asked, pointing to the desk. Chen followed his gaze, moving to examine the journal. "This is Eleanor's handwriting," he confirmed, opening the cover carefully. "It appears to be her research notes specific to whatever is contained in that historical journal." As Chen began reading, his expression shifted from professional interest to deepening concern. "Jackson," he said after several minutes, "this is more complicated than we anticipated. According to Eleanor's notes, the journal belonged to a Continental Army officer who oversaw intelligence operations in the Pennsylvania Territory. It contains detailed accounts of covert activities that directly contradict the historical record regarding several prominent revolutionary figures." "Contradicts how?" Jackson asked. "It suggests certain individuals celebrated as patriots were actually engaged in profiteering and potentially treasonous negotiations with British representatives," Chen explained, his tone measured. "If authenticated, these accounts would significantly alter our understanding of key revolutionary events and personalities, several of whom have descendants among the nation's most powerful families today." The implications became clearer. "You're saying this journal could damage reputations and legacies that have stood for over 2 centuries. Chen nodded grimly, which would explain both Eleanor's extraordinary security measures and potentially her disappearance. Historical truth can have contemporary consequences when it intersects with power and wealth. Jackson thought of the museum director's earlier comment about Whitaker potentially recovering documents from private collections, reading between the lines to grasp the fuller implication. "You think she obtained this journal through extra-legal means, removed it from a private collection where it was being suppressed?" "Eleanor believed history belonged to everyone," Chen replied carefully. "She was committed to preserving and revealing historical truth, particularly when it had been deliberately obscured. Her methods were sometimes unconventional by academic standards, and you think someone made her disappear because of this journal?" The suggestion seemed melodramatic, yet Jackson's military experience had taught him that power, when threatened, could respond with surprising ruthlessness. "I don't know," Chen admitted. But according to her notes, Eleanor had received threats after making inquiries about certain Revolutionary-era documents rumored to be in private hands. She established this secure storage and arranged the contingency plan with someone identified only as WR shortly before her disappearance. Wallace Reid. The connection between Jackson's great-uncle and the missing historian was no longer speculative, but confirmed by Eleanor's own documentation. Somehow, Wallace had been entrusted with ensuring the preservation of materials Eleanor believed might be targeted for destruction or suppression. "There's more," Chen continued, turning a page in Eleanor's research journal. She left explicit instructions about what should happen to these materials if she was unable to complete her work. They're addressed to someone she refers to as the guardian, presumably your great-uncle originally, and now it seems you. Jackson accepted Eleanor's journal from Chen. The weight of the book in his hands, nothing compared to the responsibility it represented. The historian had written in a precise academic hand, but the content revealed an intensity that transcended scholarly detachment. Her final entries outlined specific instructions for the guardian of her collection, procedures for preservation, documentation protocols, and most significantly, guidelines for eventual public disclosure. She intended this material to be released, Jackson said, looking up from the detailed directives, not just preserved in secrecy but strategically revealed through academic channels after proper authentication and documentation. Chen nodded, his expression somber. Eleanor was committed to historical truth, but she wasn't naive about the potential consequences of revealing information that contradicts established narratives, especially those that serve powerful interests. Together, they read through Eleanor's contingency plan, which outlined a methodical approach to bringing the collection to light. She had identified trusted colleagues at several universities who could authenticate the materials and provide institutional support for publication. She had established protocols for digital preservation of the most sensitive documents. Most strikingly, she had prepared legal documentation asserting the provenance and academic significance of the collection, paperwork that could protect whoever eventually made it public. She anticipated resistance, Jackson observed. Maybe even threats, with good reason, Chen replied. Historical revelations that challenge cherished national myths have always faced opposition. When those revelations potentially implicate the ancestors of influential families in misconduct or betrayal, the stakes become personal as well as ideological. The historian moved back to the display case containing the Revolutionary-era journal, studying it with professional intensity. This is the linchpin of her collection, the piece that transforms interesting historical documentation into potentially explosive revelation. Without this journal, the other materials remain significant, but not necessarily controversial. Jackson thought of the secure door and elaborate preservation system protecting this single item. And this is what someone might have wanted badly enough to make her disappear? It's possible, Chen acknowledged. In my field, we rarely encounter situations where historical research puts the researcher in physical danger. But Eleanor was investigating aspects of revolutionary history that intersect with contemporary power structures. Certain American families trace their wealth and influence directly to this period and have built their identities around ancestral connections to revolutionary heroes. The implications hung in the air between them, neither man willing to explicitly articulate the more sinister possibilities surrounding Whitaker's disappearance. Instead, they focused on the practical considerations presented by their discovery. "We need to secure this site more effectively," Jackson said, military training asserting itself in his thinking, "and document everything thoroughly before making any decisions about next steps." Chen agreed, suggesting they create comprehensive digital backups of Eleanor's research notes and catalog the visible documents before attempting to remove anything from the bunker. "We should also research any connection between your great-uncle and Eleanor. Understanding why she chose him as her contingency might provide important context." As afternoon faded toward evening, they carefully secured the inner chamber and main bunker, ensuring all materials remained exactly as they had found them. The weight of responsibility settled on Jackson's shoulders as he locked the equipment shed behind them. He had come to Clearfield County seeking nothing more than a quiet place to rebuild his life. Now he found himself the custodian of historically significant materials with potentially explosive implications. "I'll need time to process all this," he told Chen as they stood beside the historian's car, "and to think about how to proceed." Chen nodded, understanding evident in his expression. "Of course, this is an extraordinary situation, but Jackson—" He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Eleanor trusted your great-uncle with this responsibility for a reason, and he, in turn, passed it to you. Whatever connection existed between them, they both believed in the importance of preserving this historical record, despite the risks." After Chen departed, Jackson walked the perimeter of his property, the fading light casting long shadows across overgrown fields. The tactical assessment was automatic, identifying vulnerable approaches, noting natural surveillance advantages, considering security improvements. The military habits he'd tried to shed in civilian life suddenly seemed relevant again, useful in ways he hadn't anticipated. That evening, seated at the kitchen table with Eleanor's published works spread before him, Jackson searched for additional clues about the historian and her connection to his great-uncle. Her academic writing was dense but accessible, revealing a mind committed to uncovering overlooked aspects of revolutionary history, particularly the contributions of ordinary people to intelligence operations that helped secure American independence. One passage particularly resonated with him. "History remembers generals and politicians, but freedom was often secured by unnamed individuals who risked everything without expectation of recognition or reward. Ordinary people who recognized that some principles transcend personal safety and comfort." The words struck a chord with Jackson's own military experience. He had served alongside men and women who embodied that ethos, who placed mission and collective welfare above individual concerns. He recognized in Eleanor Whitaker's writing a kindred commitment to principles larger than self-interest. His search for connections between the historian and Wallace Reid proved more challenging. His great-uncle had been a peripheral figure in Jackson's life, present at occasional family gatherings, but never particularly engaged. Jackson knew he had worked for the government in some capacity, though the specifics had never been discussed. The few interactions Jackson recalled revealed little about the man's character or connections. Unable to sleep, Jackson eventually returned to the bunker shortly before midnight, drawn by a nagging sense that they had overlooked something important. The underground chamber felt different in the solitude of night. the preservation efforts of Eleanor Whitaker more poignant somehow without the academic enthusiasm of Chen's presence. Jackson methodically re-examined the outer room, paying particular attention to areas they might have overlooked during their focus on the documents themselves. At the back of one shelf, partially concealed behind a container of maps, he discovered a small metal box they had missed earlier. Unlike the archival containers, this box had a modern combination lock. Jackson examined it carefully, noting the style and age were consistent with the other security measures Eleanor had implemented. On a hunch, he tried the same numeric sequence Chen had decoded from the footnote reference. The lock opened with a satisfying click. Inside lay a sealed envelope, addressed simply to the Guardian, and a small notebook bound in worn leather. Jackson opened the envelope first, finding a handwritten letter dated 2 weeks before Eleanor's reported disappearance. "To whomever Wallace has designated as guardian of this collection," it began. "If you are reading this, circumstances have prevented me from completing my work as intended. The responsibility now falls to you to ensure these materials are properly preserved and, when the time is right, made available to the historical community." The letter continued with personal context that filled crucial gaps in Jackson's understanding. "I met Wallace Reid during my initial research into revolutionary intelligence networks operating in Pennsylvania. His background in government archives provided valuable perspective on historical document preservation and security protocols. When I discovered materials that pointed toward historically significant but potentially controversial information, Wallace offered assistance in establishing this secure repository." Eleanor explained that Wallace had identified the recently foreclosed farm property as an ideal location for the secure storage facility, citing its isolated position and historical connection to Revolutionary-era transportation routes. He had arranged the purchase through intermediaries to maintain secrecy and had helped design the bunker's security systems. "Wallace understands, as I do, that historical truth sometimes requires protection from those who would suppress it for personal or political reasons. The journal secured in the inner chamber contains first-hand accounts that directly contradict the sanitized historical narrative surrounding several prominent revolutionary figures. Its authenticity, once verified, will require reconsideration of established historical interpretations, a process that will inevitably face resistance from institutions and individuals invested in existing narratives." The letter concluded with a personal note that shifted from professional to poignant. "I don't know what circumstances might prevent me from completing this work, but I've arranged this contingency because the historical record is more important than any individual researcher. If something has happened to me, I ask you to consider carefully whether conditions exist for this material to receive fair academic consideration. The truth serves no purpose if it is revealed only to be buried again." Timing and proper authentication will be essential. Wallace will understand the significance of waiting for the right moment. I trust he has chosen his successor with equal care. Jackson set the letter aside, unsettled by its implications and the eerie prescience it suggested. About the writer's fate, he turned his attention to the leather notebook, which proved to be a personal journal rather than academic notes. The entries provided a more intimate picture of Eleanor Whitaker during her final months in Clearfield County. her excitement about historical discoveries balanced against growing concern about unexplained incidents she perceived as warnings. She described strange vehicles parked near her rental cabin, unexplained attempts to access her computer, and a break-in where nothing appeared to have been taken. More disturbing were references to phone calls where the caller remained silent, and an encounter with a stranger who had commented on her research in terms that suggested detailed knowledge of her work that shouldn't have been publicly available. The final entry, dated 3 days before her disappearance, was particularly chilling. W has completed the secure facility and helped transfer the most sensitive materials. The journal is now protected in the inner chamber, with preservation systems that should maintain its condition indefinitely. I've prepared copies of my authentication notes and provenance documentation for secure storage off-site. If my suspicions about the Carrington Foundation's interest in suppressing this material are justified, these precautions may prove necessary sooner than I anticipated. Meeting with their representative tomorrow, a courtesy I've agreed to despite W's concerns, if only to assess what they actually know about my research. The Carrington Foundation. The name triggered a vague recognition in Jackson's memory. A prestigious historical preservation organization with connections to one of America's oldest families. He would need to research this connection further to understand its significance. Jackson secured the metal box with its revelatory contents and returned to the farmhouse, his mind working through the implications of what he had discovered. Eleanor Whitaker had been aware of potential threats to her research and had taken elaborate precautions to protect both the historical materials and the truth they represented. She had collaborated with Wallace Reid, whose government background had provided expertise in secure document storage and preservation. Most significantly, Wallace had deliberately maintained his connection to the property after Eleanor's disappearance, neither accessing the bunker himself nor revealing its existence to authorities, honoring what appeared to be a commitment to protect the collection until the appropriate time for disclosure. And now that responsibility had passed to Jackson, a man who had come to Clearfield County seeking nothing more than a quiet place to rebuild his shattered life, but who now found himself entrusted with historically significant materials and potentially explosive information about America's founding period. The following morning, Jackson called Chen with an edited account of his discoveries, omitting the more troubling aspects of Eleanor's personal journal, while sharing the confirmation of Wallace Reid's involvement in establishing the secure storage facility. "This clarifies the connection," Chen said, his voice conveying professional excitement despite the early hour. Wallace Reid wasn't just a random acquaintance, but an active collaborator in Eleanor's preservation efforts. Did the letter mention his professional background? "Government archives," Jackson replied, deliberately vague. Something in Eleanor's journals had triggered an intuitive caution about sharing too much information too quickly, even with the seemingly trustworthy historian. "That makes sense," Chen continued. "The storage system has elements of government archival protocols, professional-grade preservation techniques beyond what most academic researchers would typically implement." They arranged to meet later that day to continue documenting the collection, with Chen bringing additional equipment for properly photographing and cataloging the historical materials. In the meantime, Jackson researched the Carrington Foundation, discovering it was indeed a prestigious historical organization founded by descendants of General William Carrington, a Revolutionary War officer celebrated for his loyalty to Washington and crucial role in several key battles. The foundation funded historical preservation projects, maintained several Carrington family properties as museums, and provided significant grants to academic research aligned with its mission of preserving and promoting America's revolutionary heritage. Its board of directors included prominent academics, business leaders, and several direct descendants of the Carrington family, including current chairman Harrison Carrington III, a former diplomat and prominent Washington figure. More intriguing was what Jackson found when he cross-referenced General William Carrington with Eleanor Whitaker's published works. She had mentioned him in several papers, always in passing and always in conventional historical terms. Nothing in her public academic writing suggested she had uncovered information that might contradict the established narrative of Carrington as a revolutionary hero. Yet her private journals and letters clearly indicated she had discovered something significant enough to warrant elaborate security measures and to potentially provoke dangerous opposition from the foundation bearing his name. When Chen arrived that afternoon, Jackson had already formulated a plan for managing their continued investigation of the collection, one that balanced academic documentation with prudent security measures. "Before we continue," he said as they prepared to return to the bunker, "I think we should discuss parameters for how we proceed. This collection presents both historical significance and potential security concerns." Chen nodded, his expression shifting from academic enthusiasm to more measured consideration. "You're concerned about Eleanor's references to opposition from people who might want this material suppressed." "I'm not dismissing those concerns," Jackson confirmed. "My military experience taught me to take security precautions seriously, especially when there's precedent for potential threats. What do you suggest?" "We continue documenting everything thoroughly, creating secure digital backups stored in multiple locations. We research the historical context, particularly regarding the Carrington connection Eleanor referenced, but we maintain strict confidentiality about specific contents, especially regarding the Revolutionary Journal, until we've established appropriate academic and potentially legal protections." Chen considered this approach, his professional interest, clearly balanced against recognition of the unusual circumstances. And that's reasonable. Proper historical methodology requires thorough documentation and authentication before public disclosure anyway, and if Eleanor's concerns about opposition were justified, caution is warranted. They spent the afternoon continuing their systematic documentation of the collection, with Chen photographing key documents and creating detailed catalogue entries while Jackson focused on securing the site and establishing protocols for their ongoing work. The historian's expertise provided crucial context for understanding the material's significance, while Jackson's military-trained focus on operational security ensured their activities remained protected from potential outside interest. As evening approached, Chen carefully packed his documentation equipment, his expression thoughtful as he prepared to depart. "You know," he said, "when I first heard about Eleanor's disappearance 30 years ago, many of us in the historical community assumed she had simply moved on to another project, perhaps abroad, where new research opportunities had drawn her. Away from Clearfield County, some suggested personal issues or academic disputes had prompted her sudden departure. He paused, looking back toward the equipment shed, concealing the entrance to the bunker. None of us seriously considered that her research might have put her in actual danger. Historians document the past. We don't typically face threats for doing so. Most historical research doesn't potentially implicate powerful contemporary figures through their ancestors, Jackson observed. Chen nodded slowly. The contents of that revolutionary journal, if authenticated and made public, would necessitate re-examination of certain founding narratives that have shaped American self-perception for generations. That kind of disruption to established historical understanding can provoke surprisingly strong resistance, even in academic circles, when it potentially affects the legacy of families who still wield significant influence. He didn't complete the thought, but the implication hung in the air between them, an uncomfortable recognition that historical truth could have contemporary consequences powerful enough to motivate desperate actions. "We'll proceed carefully," Jackson assured him, "following Eleanor's preservation protocols while establishing appropriate security measures. The truth doesn't benefit anyone if it's suppressed again before proper documentation and authentication." As Chen's car disappeared down the driveway, Jackson surveyed his property with new awareness. What had initially appeared to be nothing more than a run-down farm, a last-chance inheritance from a distant relative, had revealed itself as something far more significant. The land he now owned had been deliberately chosen for its strategic attributes. The dilapidated buildings concealing a carefully designed, secure facility protecting historically significant materials. Most importantly, Jackson himself had been selected, perhaps not randomly, as the new guardian of Eleanor Whitaker's hidden legacy. His great-uncle had passed this responsibility to him specifically, despite their limited personal connection, suggesting Wallace Reid had seen something in his military background or personal character that made him suitable for this unexpected role. For the first time since leaving the Army, Jackson felt a sense of purpose that transcended mere survival. The skills and attributes that had defined his military service, attention to detail, security awareness, commitment to mission completion despite obstacles, suddenly seemed relevant to civilian life in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had come to Clearfield County, seeking nothing more than shelter and solitude. Instead, he had found himself entrusted with a historical legacy of potentially national significance, and perhaps with the responsibility of revealing truths that others had worked to keep hidden for centuries. The next morning dawned with a clarity that seemed at odds with the increasingly complex situation Jackson found himself navigating. He had spent much of the night reviewing Eleanor's personal journals, piecing together the events leading to her disappearance and her connection to Wallace Reid. The picture that emerged was both more detailed and more troubling than their initial discoveries had suggested. Eleanor had begun her research in Clearfield County, focused on documenting the overlooked contributions of rural Pennsylvania communities to Revolutionary War intelligence efforts. What started as an academic exploration of historical footnotes had evolved when she discovered references to a previously unknown operative who had coordinated intelligence throughout the Western Territories, someone identified in coded communications only as Sentinel. Through methodical research and what Eleanor described as fortunate connections with private collectors, She had eventually located the journal, now secured in the bunker's inner chamber. The journal belonged to Sentinel himself, and its contents apparently contradicted established historical accounts of several key revolutionary figures, most notably General William Carrington, celebrated forefather of the prominent Carrington family. According to Eleanor's notes, the journal provided evidence that Carrington, far from being the unwavering patriot portrayed in historical accounts, had engaged in secret negotiations with British representatives while publicly maintaining his Continental Army position. These negotiations allegedly involved trading military intelligence for guarantees regarding his extensive property holdings should the British prevail, essentially a hedged bet against the American cause. More damning were Sentinel's detailed accounts of Carrington confiscating supplies meant for Washington's troops at Valley Forge, diverting them instead to private warehouses where they were sold at inflated prices to desperate civilians, profiteering from the same revolutionary conflict that had established his historical reputation as a principled military leader. If authenticated, these revelations would fundamentally alter historical understanding of a figure whose legacy had shaped both national narratives and the considerable influence of his descendants. The Carrington Foundation, established by family heirs, had spent generations burnishing and promoting their ancestors' reputation as a foundational American hero. Eleanor's journals documented increasing concern as her research progressed. She described unusual interest in her work from individuals connected to the Carrington Foundation, including unannounced visits to her rental cabin and seemingly casual encounters in which strangers demonstrated suspicious knowledge of her recent research activities. Wallace Reid had entered the picture approximately 6 months before Eleanor's disappearance. Her initial references described him as a government archivist with expertise in historical document preservation, who had offered assistance with properly storing her growing collection of fragile historical materials. As their collaboration deepened, Eleanor revealed more about Reid's background. He had spent decades working for agencies she never explicitly named, but described as responsible for managing sensitive historical documentation with national security implications. His expertise extended beyond simple preservation to include secure storage protocols and counterintelligence measures for protecting vulnerable historical materials. Most significantly, it appeared Reid had recognized the potential danger in Eleanor's discoveries before she had fully acknowledged it herself. He had urged caution in her communications about the Sentinel Journal, had suggested security measures for her research materials, and had ultimately proposed establishing the secure facility beneath the foreclosed farm property when her concerns about outside interest in her work intensified. The final entries in Eleanor's journal documented increasing incidents that had convinced her Reid's security concerns were justified. Strange vehicles parked near her cabin, evidence of covert searches of her living space, intercepted mail. Her last entry described an upcoming meeting with a Carrington Foundation representative named Phillips, who had contacted her directly after learning of her research through what she called channels that should not have had access to this information. The meeting had been scheduled for June 17, 1993. Eleanor Whitaker had been reported missing on June 18th. Her cabin had been found empty, personal belongings and research materials gone, vanished along with the historian herself. Jackson set aside the journal, rubbing his eyes against the fatigue of a mostly sleepless night. The implications were disturbing, but still circumstantial. Eleanor could have chosen to disappear, taking her research underground in response to perceived threats. There was no concrete evidence of foul play, despite the suspicious timing. What troubled him most was the recognition that if Eleanor's concerns had been justified 30 years ago, the same interests that might have orchestrated her disappearance could potentially still be motivated to suppress her discoveries. By continuing her work, he and Chen might be walking into the same dangerous territory that had led to her vanishing. Jackson's military training had instilled a methodical approach to threat assessment. He needed more information before determining appropriate security measures, particularly regarding the Carrington Foundation and its current activities. He also needed to better understand Wallace Reid's role in this unfolding mystery and why his great-uncle had chosen him specifically as the inheritor of both the property and its hidden responsibilities. After a quick breakfast, Jackson drove into Ridgemont, parking in front of the small local library where Irene Fowler had previously helped him with information about Eleanor Whitaker. The librarian greeted him with the easy familiarity small towns reserved for recognized newcomers. "Back for more local history?" she asked, setting aside the book she'd been cataloguing. "Something like that," Jackson replied. "I'm trying to find information about my great-uncle Wallace Reid. I realized I know very little about him, despite inheriting his property." Irene considered this, tapping a pencil thoughtfully against her desk. Wallace kept to himself mostly, visited the farm perhaps twice a year, never stayed long. Not much for socializing, though he was always polite when he did come into town. Did he ever mention why he bought the property? It seems an unusual investment for someone who lived elsewhere and had no farming background. "Can't say he did," Irene replied, "though there was speculation, of course. Some thought he might be planning for retirement. Others wondered if he had some historical interest in the place. The Mercer farm dates back to the 1790s, one of the earliest settlements in the county." Jackson nodded, considering how to approach his next question without revealing too much. "Did he ever mention knowing Eleanor Whitaker? I understand she was doing historical research in the area around the time he purchased the property." Something flickered in Irene's expression, a momentary sharpening of interest that suggested the question had struck a meaningful chord. "Now, that's interesting you should ask," she said, lowering her voice slightly, though the library was empty, except for them. There was talk about that, especially after Eleanor disappeared. Wallace bought the property just a few months later, and some folks wondered if there might be a connection. What kind of connection? Irene glanced toward the library entrance, then back to Jackson. Eleanor was very interested in the original Mercer homestead, the farm Wallace eventually purchased. She had researched the property's history extensively, believed it had connections to Revolutionary War activities in the region. After she vanished and Wallace acquired the place, there was some speculation he might have been continuing her research somehow. Did anyone ever ask him directly? Samuel Johnson did. He was the Historical Society president before Marcus Chen took over. Sam was direct that way. Said Wallace just smiled politely and said he found the countryside restful. Irene shrugged. After a while, people stopped speculating. Wallace was private but respected, always made generous donations to local causes, paid his property taxes promptly, never caused any trouble. The conversation yielded little concrete information, but reinforced Jackson's growing suspicion that Wallace Reid's purchase of the property had been directly connected to Eleanor's research and subsequent disappearance. He spent another hour researching local newspapers from 1993, finding brief mentions of the historian's disappearance, but little substantive reporting beyond basic facts. She had been reported missing when she failed to attend a scheduled presentation. Her cabin had been found empty, with no signs of forced entry, and authorities had eventually concluded she had left voluntarily after an extensive but fruitless investigation. Before leaving the library, Jackson checked recent news regarding the Carrington Foundation, discovering they had announced a major new initiative just 2 months earlier, a revolutionary truth project described as a multi-million-dollar effort to preserve and protect authentic artifacts and documentation from America's founding era. The Foundation's press release emphasized the importance of ensuring historical accuracy against modern revisionist trends and safeguarding the legacy of America's founding fathers. The timing and language struck Jackson as potentially significant, particularly given Eleanor's concerns about the Foundation's interest in suppressing contradictory historical evidence. He made notes of the key figures mentioned in connection with the project, including Harrison Carrington III and Dr. Lawrence Phillips, the Foundation's Director of Historical Acquisitions, Phillips. The name matched the Carrington representative. Eleanor had mentioned meeting just before her disappearance. The fact that he remained affiliated with the Foundation 3 decades later suggested a continuity of institutional knowledge, and potentially of interest in Eleanor's research if it indeed threatened the Carrington family legacy. Jackson's next stop was the county records office, where he requested documentation related to Wallace Reid's purchase of the property in 1994. The transaction history revealed the farm had been foreclosed and purchased at auction by a corporate entity called Sentinel Historical Trust, which had subsequently transferred ownership to Wallace Reid personally. The name of the trust could hardly be coincidental, given Eleanor's research focus on the revolutionary operative code-named Sentinel. By early afternoon, Jackson had assembled enough background information to begin constructing a more coherent narrative. Wallace Reid, leveraging expertise gained through government work in sensitive document preservation, had apparently collaborated with Eleanor Whitaker to secure her controversial discoveries. When she disappeared under suspicious circumstances, Reid had maintained the secure facility they had established together, preserving her collection while keeping its existence secret. What remained unclear was why Reid had never attempted to continue Eleanor's work himself or bring her discoveries to light during his lifetime, and perhaps most puzzling, why he had chosen Jackson, a great-nephew with whom he had minimal personal connection, as the inheritor of both the property and its hidden historical treasures. Jackson returned to the farm to find Chen's car already parked in the driveway, the historian waiting on the porch with evident impatience. As Jackson approached, he noticed Chen clutching a folder with unusual tension, his typically calm academic demeanor replaced by barely contained excitement. "I've found something significant," Chen announced without preamble. "Records that might help us authenticate the Sentinel Journal and understand why Eleanor's research was potentially so threatening to certain interests." Inside, Chen spread documents across the kitchen table, photocopies of archival materials he had accessed through academic connections at the State Historical Society in Harrisburg. These are Continental Army disciplinary proceedings from 1778, he explained, not digitized, rarely accessed, and containing references to an internal investigation into supply mismanagement during the Valley Forge encampment. The records documented an inquiry into missing provisions originally attributed to British interception, but subsequently linked to unauthorized diversion by unnamed officers within Washington's command structure. The investigation had been abruptly terminated by order of Congress, with all materials sealed and participants sworn to secrecy for the preservation of military cohesion during this critical period of conflict. This independently confirms one of the central allegations described in Eleanor's notes about the Sentinel Journal, Chen said, his voice tight with controlled academic excitement. There was indeed an official investigation into supply misappropriation that aligned with the time frame when Carrington served at Valley Forge. The investigation was shut down before conclusions were reached, but the mere existence of these proceedings lends credibility to the journal's contents. Jackson studied the documents, noting the precise military language that hadn't changed much in 2 centuries. Why wouldn't this investigation be included in standard historical accounts of the period? Because it was deliberately buried, Chen replied, likely to protect the reputation of officers whose support was deemed essential to the revolutionary cause. Remember, Washington's command was politically precarious at times. He couldn't afford to alienate powerful supporters, even if some were engaged in questionable activities. And the Carrington family has maintained that protective silence for generations since, Jackson observed. Exactly. Historical narratives once established are defended most vigorously by those who benefit from them. The Carrington family fortune and influence were built on the foundation of their ancestors' reputation as a patriot hero. Anything that undermines that narrative threatens not just historical understanding, but contemporary identity and power. The implications extended beyond academic concerns into the realm of potential danger that had worried Eleanor before her disappearance, and that now shadowed their own investigation into her hidden collection. If powerful interests had intervened to suppress her discoveries 30 years ago, those same interests might still be motivated to protect established historical narratives from contradictory evidence. We need to accelerate our documentation efforts, Jackson decided. Create secure backups of everything in the collection and establish proper authentication chains for the key materials, particularly the Sentinel Journal. Chen nodded agreement. I've arranged access to specialized equipment from the University Conservation Lab, portable scanners designed for fragile historical documents, environmental monitoring tools, proper archival materials for any items that need rehousing. We can create comprehensive digital records while maintaining the physical collection intact. They spent the remainder of the afternoon establishing a detailed work plan for documenting the collection, with Chen providing academic expertise on proper handling and preservation protocols, while Jackson focused on security measures to protect both the materials and their research activities. As evening approached, Chen packed up his notes and prepared to depart. I'll return tomorrow with the conservation equipment, he said. In the meantime, I'll continue researching the historical context for the Sentinel Journal, establishing the documentary evidence that would support authentication of its contents. After Chen left, Jackson conducted a thorough security assessment of the property, identifying vulnerabilities and developing countermeasures based on his military experience. The farm's isolated location provided both advantages and challenges. Limited approach routes made surveillance easier, but also meant less potential for witnesses or assistance if security was breached. He established motion sensors at key points, along the driveway and property boundaries, positioning them to provide early warning of any approaching vehicles or individuals. He improved the locks on the equipment shed and reinforced the trapdoor mechanism with additional security features. Most importantly, he created redundant documentation of key materials from Eleanor's collection, storing backups in multiple, secure locations separate from the bunker itself. As night fell, Jackson reviewed the day's discoveries while cleaning his grandfather's revolver, a .38 Special that had been among the few personal items he'd brought to the farm. The familiar routine of weapons maintenance provided a meditative backdrop for organizing his thoughts about the unfolding situation. Eleanor Whitaker had discovered historical evidence that contradicted cherished national narratives about revolutionary heroes, specifically evidence that implicated General William Carrington in profiteering and conditional loyalty rather than the principled patriotism attributed to him in historical accounts. Her discoveries threatened not just academic understanding, but the foundation of a prominent family's historical legacy and contemporary influence. Wallace Reid, leveraging expertise from government work in sensitive document preservation, had helped Eleanor establish a secure facility for protecting these historically significant but potentially controversial materials. When she disappeared under circumstances that suggested external intervention, Reid had maintained the secure facility and arranged for its eventual transfer to someone who might continue the work of preserving and potentially revealing historical truths that others had worked to suppress. Now that responsibility had fallen to Jackson, a former Army sergeant whose military training had unexpectedly prepared him for securing and protecting historically significant materials against potential threats from those who might prefer certain truths remain hidden. The skills that had seemed irrelevant to civilian life suddenly provided exactly the expertise needed for this unexpected mission. As he reassembled the revolver with practiced efficiency, Jackson considered the parallels between his current situation and his military service. Both involved protecting principles larger than individual interests. In Afghanistan, he had worked to secure communities against forces that would impose ideological control. Here, he found himself safeguarding historical truth against powerful interests that would maintain comfortable national myths at the expense of accuracy. The fundamental mission remained consistent, ensuring that intimidation and power could not override more fundamental values, whether those of self-determination for Afghan villagers or historical integrity for the American public. For the first time since leaving the service, Jackson felt the purposeful clarity that had defined his military career, a mission that justified vigilance and perseverance despite potential risks. What he couldn't know as he secured his grandfather's revolver in the bedside drawer and prepared for another restless night of monitoring his security systems was that the parallels to his military experience would soon extend beyond philosophical similarities into the realm of active threat assessment and response. The historical treasures hidden beneath his inherited property had already attracted attention from interests who had worked for generations to protect certain narratives from contradiction, a tension that would soon manifest in ways that would test both his security preparations and his commitment to the unexpected mission he had inherited, along with Eleanor Whitaker's hidden legacy. The perimeter alarm triggered at 2:17 a.m., jolting Jackson from light sleep to instant alertness. A vehicle had turned onto the property's access road, headlights extinguished. Despite the moonless night, years of military training reasserted themselves as he moved efficiently through the darkened farmhouse, retrieving his grandfather's revolver and positioning himself at a window with clear sightlines to the approaching threat. The vehicle, an unmarked black SUV with government plates, stopped well short of the house. Two men emerged, their movements disciplined and coordinated in a way Jackson recognized immediately. These weren't local troublemakers or random trespassers. Their tactical positioning and communication patterns revealed professional training. They approached the equipment shed with purpose, bypassing the farmhouse entirely. Jackson's jaw tightened. They knew exactly what they were looking for. Moving silently through the back door, Jackson circled through the overgrown field, using terrain features for concealment as he closed the distance. The men had already defeated his new padlock and entered the shed. He had perhaps 2 minutes before they would locate the trapdoor. "Federal agents," Jackson called out, weapon raised but not yet aimed at the figures now frozen in the shed's doorway. "Identify yourselves and state your purpose on private property." The taller man turned slowly, hands deliberately visible. "Mr. Reid, my name is Thomas Phillips. This is my colleague, Agent Donovan. We're with the National Historical Conservation Unit." "There's no such agency," Jackson replied evenly, maintaining his position. A thin smile crossed Phillips's face. "Perceptive. Military background serves you well." He reached carefully into his jacket, producing an ID that gleamed momentarily in the dim light. "The truth, then. Department of Heritage Protection. It's not a public-facing division. Still waiting to hear why you're trespassing on my property at 2 a.m. "We're here about Eleanor Whitaker's collection," Phillips said directly. "Specifically about historically sensitive materials that require proper federal oversight. The confirmation that external forces knew about the bunker sent a chill through Jackson, though he maintained his composed exterior. Any legitimate government interest could be addressed during daylight hours, through proper channels. Unfortunately, Mr. Reid, these materials fall under special classification protocols. Your great-uncle understood this arrangement before his death." Jackson's mind raced, connecting fragments from Eleanor's journals with the current confrontation. "Wallace Reid never gave you access to this property or its contents, and neither will I without proper documentation and verification." Phillips sighed, exchanging glances with his partner. "We had hoped for cooperation, given your military service record. Sergeant Reid, the materials beneath this shed have national security implications. They contain unverified historical claims that, if mishandled, could damage public trust in founding institutions." "Historical truth doesn't threaten national security," Jackson countered. "It strengthens it." Admirable sentiment, but naive. Some historical contexts require careful management. The Carrington family has served this nation for generations. Their foundation funds critical preservation work that benefits all Americans. Unsubstantiated allegations from questionable sources would serve no public good. The pieces locked into place for Jackson. "You're not government agents. You work for the Carrington Foundation." Phillips didn't deny it. "We represent interests that align with national historical integrity." "The same. Interests that attempted to reason with Dr. Whitaker 30 years ago. Before she disappeared, Jackson added pointedly, "A regrettable situation that needn't be repeated," Phillips replied, his tone shifting subtly toward implied threat. "We're prepared to offer significant compensation for the quiet transfer of these materials to appropriate custodianship." Before Jackson could respond, headlights swept across the driveway as another vehicle approached. Dr. Chen's sedan came to an abrupt stop, the historian emerging with uncharacteristic urgency. "Jackson," he called out, then froze upon seeing the confrontation. "I came as soon as I got the alert. The motion sensors triggered a notification to my phone." Phillips turned to assess this new development with evident displeasure. "Dr. Marcus, Chen, your involvement complicates matters unnecessarily." "I know exactly who you are," Chen replied, his academic calm replaced by barely controlled anger. "Lawrence Phillips. You met with Eleanor the day before she disappeared." Phillips didn't flinch at the accusation. "Ancient history, Professor. We're discussing present arrangements. We're discussing historical materials you have no legal claim to," Chen countered, moving to stand beside Jackson. "Materials that Eleanor Whitaker protected precisely because she anticipated this kind of interference. The standoff might have escalated further, if not for the distant sound of approaching vehicles, multiple engines growing louder by the second." "That would be the county sheriff," Jackson informed Phillips calmly, "along with several neighbors, who monitor an emergency channel I activated when my perimeter alarm was triggered. Small towns have advantages that way." Phillips assessed the changing tactical situation with visible frustration. "This isn't over, Sergeant Reid. Those materials contain unverified historical claims that require proper context and validation before any public disclosure." "Exactly our intention," Chen interjected. "Professional academic authentication and context. The processes of historical scholarship rather than managed narratives." As approaching headlights illuminated the driveway, Phillips and his partner retreated to their vehicle with the disciplined efficiency of men accustomed to strategic withdrawal. "We'll be in touch through more conventional channels," Phillips called over his shoulder. "The Carrington Foundation has considerable resources for supporting appropriate historical research." Within minutes, Sheriff Davis and 3 pickup trucks carrying local farmers had arrived, transforming the tense confrontation into a community response. Jackson provided a carefully edited account of the incident, describing suspicious trespassers who had fled when confronted. The sheriff took notes while the neighbors offered to establish an informal watch rotation for the property. "Nobody messes with one of our own," Earl Lewis declared firmly, the retired factory worker having arrived still wearing pajama bottoms beneath his coat. "You just give the word, and we'll make sure somebody's keeping an eye out day and night." The unexpected support from neighbors he barely knew caught Jackson off guard. In just a few weeks, he had somehow transitioned from isolated outsider to community member worth protecting. The contrast with his anonymous existence in Philadelphia could hardly have been more stark. After the sheriff and neighbors departed, Jackson and Chen retreated to the farmhouse kitchen to assess their situation over strong coffee. "They know about the collection," Jackson stated flatly. "They know exactly what's here and why it matters." Chen nodded grimly. Lawrence Phillips was the Carrington Foundation representative Eleanor mentioned meeting before her disappearance. "His presence confirms our worst suspicions about their involvement then and their continued interest now." "They'll try again," Jackson predicted, "next time through seemingly legitimate channels. legal challenges, historical preservation claims, perhaps even manufactured questions about ownership. We need to accelerate our documentation and authentication process, Chen agreed. Create irrefutable evidence chains and secure the most significant materials before they can interfere further. Jackson made a decision that had been forming in his mind since the confrontation. We need to go public, strategically and selectively, but soon. Eleanor's journals suggest she believed the Sentinel materials would only be truly protected once, properly documented and disclosed through legitimate academic channels. A controlled revelation, Chen mused, considering the implications. My university connections could provide initial academic review without attracting undue attention. Once proper authentication is established, the materials themselves become the story rather than any controversy about their provenance. Over the following weeks, they executed their plan with methodical precision. Chen arranged for 3 trusted colleagues, specialists in Revolutionary War history, document authentication, and military communications, to independently examine selected materials from Eleanor's collection. Jackson implemented enhanced security measures while continuing his renovation of the farmhouse, maintaining the appearance of a veteran simply rebuilding his life while the more significant work proceeded in secured locations. The Carrington Foundation made several approaches through increasingly official channels. First, an attorney presenting ownership questions about potential historical artifacts on the property, then a representative from a prestigious university offering a research partnership with substantial funding, and finally a direct outreach from Harrison Carrington III himself, proposing a private meeting to discuss mutual historical interests. Jackson declined each approach politely but firmly, buying time while the authentication process proceeded. Chen's academic colleagues confirmed what Eleanor had documented decades earlier. The Sentinel Journal was indeed authentic, its contents verifiably written during the Revolutionary period by someone with direct access to military operations and communications. 3 months after their midnight confrontation with Phillips, Jackson and Chen stood in the university auditorium as Chen presented their findings to a packed audience of historians, academic researchers, and media representatives. The controlled disclosure had been carefully structured to emphasize historical significance rather than sensation, focusing on the broader intelligence networks that had operated throughout Pennsylvania during the Revolution, rather than specifically highlighting the Carrington revelations. Nevertheless, as the presentation concluded and questions began, the implications became unavoidable. When directly asked about General William Carrington's activities documented in the Sentinel Journal, Chen provided a measured response that acknowledged the materials contained evidence that necessitates scholarly reconsideration of certain established narratives, while emphasizing the importance of contextualizing individual actions within the complex realities of revolutionary conflict. In the weeks that followed, the academic community embraced the discovered materials with enthusiasm, unclouded by the political considerations that had worried Eleanor 30 years earlier. The Carrington Foundation, faced with scholarly consensus about the authenticity of the documents, pivoted to a strategy of historical contextualization, acknowledging the evidence while funding research into the complicated choices faced by all revolutionary figures during times of existential national crisis. For Jackson, The resolution brought unexpected direction to a life that had drifted since leaving military service. The National Archives offered him a position in their Historical Preservation Security Division, a role that would utilize both his military background and newly developed expertise in protecting historically significant materials. More meaningful was his acceptance in the Clearfield County community, where his defense of historical truth had transformed him from outsider to respected local. 6 months after their initial discovery of Eleanor Whitaker's hidden archive, Jackson and Chen stood in the newly established Eleanor Whitaker Historical Research Center, converted from the original farmhouse, with funding from a coalition of universities and historical societies. The bunker itself had been preserved as Eleanor had designed it, now serving as a secure storage facility for particularly fragile materials from her collection. She would have approved, Chen observed, as they watched researchers carefully examining documents in the center's main room. Not just the preservation of the materials, but their accessibility to legitimate scholarly investigation. Jackson nodded, thinking of the historian whose passion for historical truth had set these events in motion decades earlier. Wallace chose me because he knew I'd defend the mission, not just the materials. Military training focuses on protecting principles, not just positions. As visitors filed through the research center, encountering history unfiltered by political considerations or family legacies, Jackson recognized that he had found something he hadn't realized he was seeking: purpose that extended beyond personal survival, community that valued his particular skills and experiences, and a mission worthy of the same commitment he had once given to military service. The unanticipated inheritance of a foreclosed farm had become the foundation for something far more significant than property ownership: the preservation of historical truth against powerful interests that would have preferred certain realities remain buried, and the discovery that civilian life could offer missions as meaningful as any he had undertaken in uniform. If this incredible story of historical discovery and courage has captivated you, make sure to hit that subscribe button right now. We deliver powerful stories like Jackson's every week, tales of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances and uncovering hidden truths that change everything. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Would you have had the courage to stand up against powerful interests to protect historical truth? What forgotten stories from our past do you think might still be waiting to be discovered? Remember to turn on notifications so you never miss our next video. Tomorrow's story reveals how a forgotten letter in an attic changed the course of medical history forever. You won't want to miss it. Until next time, keep searching for truth, and remember, sometimes the most valuable treasures aren't gold or artifacts, but the courage to protect the stories that shaped our world.